On behalf of the National Museum of the Pacific War, the Admiral Nimitz Foundation, my name is Richard Frank, and this is a webinar, The Battle of Leyte Gulf. This is the first in a series of webinars the museum is going to sponsor over the coming year. We welcome you and thank you very much for attending. I'm going to take a amount of material which really is about the size of an iceberg and reduce it to the size of an ice cube in terms of getting this presentation in within the time limit we have. I will be using photographs from the National Archives as background for most of these slides, which are from the Battle of Leyte Gulf with a few exceptions of personality photographs. So with that, let me talk about the organization. Basically, I'm going to cover the background very quickly, then the events on October 23rd and 24th, and then look particularly at the decision-making of Admiral William F. Halsey, Jr. and Vice Admiral Thomas C. Kincaid. Then we'll cover the actions on the 25th and 26th of October and move on to conclusions, following which there'll be a short presentation by Chris McDougall about some very interesting detective work he did at the Nimitz Museum. So with that, let's get going. The background starts in March 1942 when President Franklin D. Roosevelt orders General Douglas MacArthur to leave his doomed command in the Philippines and go to Australia. When MacArthur arrives in Australia, he makes the famous pledge, "I shall return," concerning return to the Philippines, which is going to be the pole star on which he's going to guide his operation for the next 3 years. Then in April 1942, Washington is unable to agree on a single commander for the Pacific Theater and correspondingly divides it into two separate commands. One becomes the Southwest Pacific area under General Douglas MacArthur, and that's the area down there to the lower left of the map I have on the screen right now. The rest of the Pacific becomes the Pacific Ocean areas and is under the command of Admiral Chester Nimitz, who is also concurrently commander of the Pacific Fleet. There is no unified command in the Pacific area, which is a factor that will play very much into the Battle of Leyte Gulf. Now, moving forward very rapidly over a vast amount of material on planning and decisions, in March 1944, the Joint Chiefs of Staff issue a directive setting out operations for the remainder of the year. The culminating operation at that point is going to be a joint operation by Admiral Nimitz and General MacArthur to go to Mindanao, which is the southernmost of the main Philippine Islands, and land there in November 1944. This plan, however, only lasts a short time, for in September 1944, Admiral William F. Halsey is conducting operations on the Philippines, and he urges that the path forward is to bypass entirely Mindanao and strike directly to Leyte, which is in the center of the Philippine Islands. This proposal is approved by MacArthur, Nimitz, and the Joint Chiefs of Staff and becomes the American target for October 20th, 1944. There's an extremely brief window of planning for this, which is also going to be a factor in what happens later. During this planning, Admiral Chester W. Nimitz issues a directive to Halsey that he's to go after the Japanese fleet if the opportunity, quote, is offered or can be created. And this too is going to play a role in what's going to happen off Leyte. Now, the organization for the Leyte invasion, which is called Operation King II, has General Douglas MacArthur as the overall commander of the ground forces. Under MacArthur are three separate components. There's the 6th Army, which is going to conduct the operations on the ashore on Leyte under Lieutenant General Walter Kruger. Supporting MacArthur's land operations are his air component, called at this point the Far Eastern Air Forces, and this is under Lieutenant General George C. Kenney. Finally, the naval forces under MacArthur, sometimes referred to as MacArthur's Navy, is technically and formally the 7th Fleet, and this is under Vice Admiral Thomas C. Kincaid. Covering all the operations around and on Leyte will be the 3rd Fleet under Admiral William F. Halsey. Halsey answers to Admiral Nimitz. There is no direct communication between Admiral Halsey and any of MacArthur's subordinate commands, and that too will be an important factor in what's going to transpire. Now, let's look at the Japanese side. The Japanese had not come out since November 1942 for a major fleet action, but they set their reorganized fleet out for a major confrontation with the U.S. fleet off the Mariana Islands in June 1944. The Japanese entered that operation with great confidence. They had 9 aircraft carriers and over 400 aircraft and expected great results. The result, however, was a catastrophe. Japanese naval air forces suffered such devastating losses that they would never recover throughout the rest of the war. Japanese lost 3 of their fleet carriers, 2 of them to American submarines. In the aftermath of this defeat, the Japanese then looked to what would be the next likely American actions. They identified the Philippines as the most likely American target. This was a fundamental concern for them because if the Americans installed air and sea forces in the Philippines, they would be able to project those to the west and cut the sea lanes of communication from Japan to the southern resource area, including, most importantly, oil. Without oil, the fleet would be useless, so therefore there was no point in saving the fleet and letting the Philippines go. Now, as to an operation that they could mount at that point with their limited resources, they based their plans around a clever psychological insight, which was that Admiral Halsey was notoriously or famously aggressive. They decided to dangle some of their aircraft carriers as decoys to lure Admiral Halsey and the Third Fleet away. Meanwhile, the remaining surface forces of the Imperial Navy, which were significant, battleships and cruisers, these would converge on Leyte Gulf, and in the Japanese plan, they would destroy the amphibious shipping and isolate General MacArthur's forces on Leyte. This, the Japanese believed, might change the course of the war. This slide gives you a visual orientation as to what the Japanese plan was. You'll see up there to the upper right, the Northern Force under Vice Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa. That was the carrier force. That was the decoy force that was intended to lure Admiral Halsey away. The main gunnery forces of the Japanese fleet at that point were called the Central Force and the Southern Force. Now, let me note, I'm using the American terms for these forces because they're a lot simpler and clearer than the Japanese terms. The Center Force under Vice Admiral Takeo Kurita was the main force. Late in the Japanese planning phase, however, they decided to detach part of Kurita's forces, which would become the Southern Force. The main component of that was a task force under Rear Admiral Shoji Nishimura. And the plan was basically that Kurita and Nishimura would converge like the closing of the jaws on the amphibious forces off Leyte Gulf, with Nishimura coming up from the south and Kurita coming down from the north. There was also very late in the plan a decision to add an additional task force under a vice admiral named Shima to Nishimura's force, and he would only play a role in the battle about an hour behind Nishimura, as we will see. Now, a rather fundamental question is, was the Japanese plan fatally flawed? And basically, when the preliminary operations to go to Leyte began on the 17th of October, the Japanese issued their order to commence their plan to engage in this fleet operation off Leyte on the 18th. But they could not actually get their ships to Leyte Gulf until the 25th of October. As you will see, by the evening of the 24th, 25th of October, about 80% of all the amphibious shipping that the Americans had taken to Leyte had already departed, leaving only 57 ships. Only a handful of them were really specialized amphibious force ships. So even if the Japanese task force has theoretically broken through and done what they were supposed to do, it's really rather not clear that this would have actually achieved anything. So let's move on to operations during the 23rd and 24th of October. The first thing becomes early in the morning of the 23rd of October. At this point, Admiral Halsey, commander of Task Force 38, is the main striking force of the Pacific Fleet. Task Force 38 comprises the fast carriers, as they're called, which are 9 fleet carriers and 8 light carriers of the Pacific Fleet, and they're escorting battleships, cruisers, and destroyers. And as the morning breaks, Halsey has no inkling that the Japanese are coming after the Americans off Leyte. In fact, most American admirals at this point did not expect the Japanese to come out after the thrashing they took in June. Halsey is aware of the fact that he has to provide continuous air cover for the Southern Fleet in operations ashore for many days to come. His carriers have been in operation since late August. He decides that he's going to have to start rotating the task groups, of which there are 4 in Task Force 38, to go back to the advanced base at Ulithi for replenishment, resupply, and upkeep. So he decides that morning to detach Task Group 1, or what's called TG 38.1, and send them back to Ulithi. This has 2 fleet carriers and 2 light carriers. They also decide to send one of the other fleet carriers, the Hancock, back with that group. Further, Halsey's notified that the fleet carrier Bunker Hill's Air Group is totally exhausted from its operations. And so it too is detached from the task force. That means by the end of the morning, Halsey's detached 4 fleet carriers and 2 light carriers from his task force. During that morning, 2 U.S. submarines who've been deployed as sentinels or scouts that dart in the days ambush Admiral Kurita's center force as it comes through Palawan Passage. They sink 2 of the Japanese heavy cruisers and so damage the third one that has to withdraw because it doesn't have a propulsion system to keep up with the fleet. One of the heavy cruisers that sunk is called the Otago. This happens to be Admiral Kurita's own flagship, and Admiral Kurita literally has to swim for his life off the sinking Otago. And this begins 3 days that Kurita is going to have little or no sleep during the battle. This too will have an important impact on the outcome. During the 24th, now alerted the Japanese are on the march, Halsey sends out search planes in the morning, and they locate both the center force, Kurita, and the southern forces, and Halsey launches strikes against them, as we'll cover later. Now, the southern force is only lightly brushed by Halsey's carrier aviators because Halsey and the other American commanders are quite confident from the strength of Nishimura's force that it's terribly outgunned by the Seventh Fleet, which is massing to meet him in Suragawa Strait. And for purposes of clarity in this presentation, we're going to go ahead and carry forward the story of Admiral Nishimura and the Southern Force to its denouement. Nishimura has 2 battleships, a heavy cruiser, and 4 destroyers with his main group. The trailing force behind him under Admiral Shima has 2 heavy cruisers, 1 light cruiser, and 4 destroyers. The Seventh Fleet Reception Committee, waiting for him in Suragawa Strait, has 6 battleships. 5 of them were survivors of the Pearl Harbor attack. There were sunk or damaged there. 3 of them also have the most sophisticated fire control equipment, Mark 8 radar, and make them deadly accurate at extreme ranges. To Nishimura's 1 cruiser, the American forces have 8, and to his 4 destroyers, the Americans have 27. Nishimura steams into Suragawa Strait, and in the course of about an hour or so, his task force is totally demolished. Both battleships are sunk, and by about 4:20 in the morning, they're gone, as is Nishimura. His other ships are either sunk or crippled, except for 1 destroyer, which gets away. And behind him comes Admiral Shima about an hour later, just about the time that Nishimura's command is being totally pulverized, and Shima makes the wise decision not to continue on. So that pretty much disposes of the Southern force in terms of the Battle of Leyte Gulf. The only thing from the American standpoint that is of concern is that the battleships have been primarily loaded with bombardment ammunition, not the kind of heavy armor-piercing ammunition they would need to deal with heavy surface ships like battleships or heavy cruisers. They have only a limited supply left by the morning of October 25th. So having seen to the end of the Southern force, let's go on to cover what else happens during the 24th and 25th. Halsey's carrier planes locate Kurita's force in what's called the Cebuan Sea during the morning of the 24th, and they launch repeated strikes against Kurita's large force, which includes 4 battleships, and at that point, 10 heavy cruisers. It includes 7 heavy cruisers and assorted destroyers. During these strikes during these strikes, Halsey's flyers are going to inflict serious damage on Kurita's forces. And Kurita appears to be withdrawing by the end of the strikes in the later part of the afternoon. We now get to the afternoon, late afternoon of October 24th, and we come to now decision-making by both Admiral Halsey and Admiral Thomas C. Kincaid. We'll take them in sequence. With respect to Admiral Halsey, to give him his decision-making, give it full understanding, we need to go back and look at everything that Halsey knows, believes he knows on that afternoon of October 24th, 1944. He's been advised by Admiral Nimitz on the 20th of October that the strategic intelligence they have indicates the Japanese total capability includes no fewer than 6 fleet carriers, 5 light carriers, and 2 battleships that have been partly modified to become carriers of seaplanes. He's also told the Japanese may have as many as 175 to 200 aircraft with trained crews, and this is enough to fully equip between 3 and 4 Japanese fleet light carriers. Let me just note as an aside that fleet carriers generally carry a lot more aircraft than light carriers. On the American side, a fleet carrier will carry between typically about 90 and 100 aircraft. A light carrier will carry about 32, 35 aircraft. On the Japanese side, a fleet carrier could carry as many as 70 planes. A light carrier is somewhere typically in the 30s. Gives you some indication of the disparate capabilities of the fleet and the light carriers. Now, in terms of tactical intelligence, what Admiral Halsey knows is that, first of all, he's not going to have any support for only Air Force planes because none have been able to move forward on any bases on Leyte. He also knows that during the day of the 24th, the Third Fleet has been subjected to very heavy air attacks by Japanese planes in the Philippines, primarily Luzon. In fact, as historian Barrett Tillman points out, before the day is over, American aircraft defending the fleet off the Philippines will claim to have shot down no fewer than 270 Japanese aircraft, which is the second highest total of the entire war. During these operations, however, one Japanese dive bomber gets through and puts a bomb into the light carrier Princeton. As a result of that damage, ultimately Princeton is sunk once again on the 24th. Now, late in the afternoon of the 24th, they detect the northern force, that's Ozawa's decoy force, first the surface ships of Ozawa's command, and then the carriers about 1640 or 440 in the afternoon. So what's Halsey's situation as he comes to his important decisions? Well, the first thing to note, which needs to be emphasized, is that when Halsey sailed in the end of August, he had 17 aircraft carriers, including 9 fleet and 8 light fleet carriers. By the time all the detachments on the 23rd have taken place, and with the loss of the Princeton, he's now down to 5 fleet and 5 light carriers. In terms of total aircraft complement, he has probably about 65% of the total number of planes he originally started with, somewhere in the vicinity of 706 versus somewhat close to 1,100 planes he started with. These figures are from a cumulative report that's turned in, which are probably inaccurate within say a dozen or 20 or so, will give you a good relative sense of the strength of the American aircraft on the carriers as Halsey's making his decisions. Now, Halsey also has learned about Darter and Dace's interception of the center force. He knows that his search planes have located these 2 jaws of the Japanese surface ship task forces, Kurita's center force and the southern forces we've talked about. And during the afternoon, for the first time, he locates his search planes locate Japanese aircraft carriers. Now, here's a point that's typically not emphasized in analysis of Halsey's decision-making, and that's the fact there have been 5 prior actions involving aircraft carriers on both sides of the Pacific War. In no fewer than 4 of those actions, the Japanese operated their carriers in at least 2 groups, sometimes more. So the fact that they've located one group of Japanese carriers, to me, my mind, should not have immediately told Halsey that they were the only Japanese aircraft carriers about to his north on the 24th of October. Now, what Halsey also knows is that the southern force has been attacked, lightly damaged. His planes have inflicted, however, heavy damage on the center force. They have sunk the super battleship the Musashi, which is the sister ship of the Yamato. These 2 ships are the largest battleships that ever put into service by any Navy. They're behemoths weighing about 72,000 tons full load. They carry guns that have a diameter of their bore of 18.1 inches, making the most heavily armed and armored battleships ever built. His airplanes have also, it turns out, have disabled one of the Japanese heavy cruisers, which has to withdraw, and they've done modest damage to other ships. When the Kurita's force is last seen during the afternoon, it's actually turned back to the west and appears to be withdrawn. What happens, however, is Kurita is then nudged by his higher commanders to continue on with his mission. So he turns around about 1750 in the afternoon and starts steaming back towards San Bernardino Strait, which he needs to go through to get to the east side of the Philippines to converge down on Leyte Gulf. Now, the other information that Halsey has or knows about is that the northern forces initially reported to him as 4 carriers, including possibly 3 fleet carriers. Later reports give it credit for 2 fleet, 1 light carrier, and at least 1 Japanese battleship carrier. Once again, Japanese capabilities include as many as 6 fleet and 5 light fleet carriers. So once again, Halsey doesn't know exactly what he's confronting, except there are Japanese carriers to his north. Now, Halsey's decision-making process goes through a number of steps. The first of which is it's pretty obvious that Southern force can be dismissed as no serious threat to the Southern fleet. And of course, that's what's going to happen. Halsey, however, believes the carrier Princeton has actually been sunk by a Japanese carrier plane. Well, the Princeton has been sunk by a Japanese carrier type plane, but was operating from a land base. And Halsey is also concerned about being what he referred to as being shuttle bombed. Well, what does this mean? Well, Japanese carrier aircraft, because they carried less defensive armor and self-sealing tanks, are lighter than American aircraft, and therefore their fuel capacity will take them to longer range. In theory, Japanese carriers could stand off at a distance, launch strikes against the American carriers, yet remain out of reach of American strike planes in retaliation. They could also do a variant of this, would be to launch from their carriers, attack the Third Fleet, land on probably Luzon, rearm and refuel, and then attack the American carriers again on the way back to their own carriers, with the Japanese carriers remaining immune from damage through this whole period. And finally, radio intelligence reaches Halsey, telling him that more Japanese planes are swarming to the Philippines after a day in which the Third Fleet has been subjected to one of the heaviest air attacks it's going to sustain in the entire war. The other major factor here, which frequently is overlooked in the decision-making process that Halsey is confronting at this point, is really looking at not just two threats, the Ozawa and the carriers to the north, and Korea and the major surface ships to the center, but also Japanese land-based aircraft in the Philippines, and particularly Luzon. So he has not two, but three major threats to consider in terms of decision-making. So now let's go to Halsey's decision-making as he described it in his report. He identifies three separate options. The first one is to divide the Third Fleet, leave his fast battleships with the Task Force 38, to guard San Bernardino Strait to block Korea, and take the carriers with the remaining screening ships to the north to confront the Japanese aircraft carriers that have been identified by his search planes. He rejects this option. Basically, he believes that Japanese carriers are too great a threat to be leave unmolested. And secondly, it will leave his battleship task force, if they have no direct air cover, exposed to Japanese air attack, which is no small issue in terms of what's going on during these days in October 1944. Option two, it's to concentrate the entire Third Fleet off San Bernardino Strait, and Halsey rejects this, basically because he believes it allows the Japanese Northern Force or carrier force to act unmolested, and he believes that the destruction of Japanese carriers is absolutely fundamental to the overall American war plan orange in terms of operations against Japan. Option number three is to strike the Northern Force with the entire Third Fleet and leave San Bernardino Strait unguarded, according to Halsey's version of his options. And this is the option that he adopts. It keeps the Third Fleet concentrated. One of the most fundamental principles that Halsey and other flag officers have been instilled in during their time in the Navy, and particularly at the Naval War College, is never divide the main fleet. The second point is that he believes this gives them the best chance to smash the Northern Force, which he continues to identify as the main threat. And he believes the center force is, as he puts it, not a serious danger because he thinks his flyers have inflicted serious damage on it, unless it was last seen retreating. And further, he at least claims in his report that even if the center force breaks through, the Third Fleet could still retrieve the situation. Well, Halsey makes some errors, he and his staff both. The first of which is they grossly overestimate the amount of damage that's been inflicted on Korea's force on the 24th of October. And the second aspect is this. Thanks to work by Evan Thomas, his work on the Battle of Leyte Gulf, he found out that Admiral Halsey had in fact been put to bed by the fleet doctor in order to get a good night's sleep before what they think is going to be the major action of the 25th of October. So Halsey is not about when reports come in late in the evening that American night flying search planes from his carriers have figured out that Korea has in fact turned back to the east and is headed for San Bernardino Strait. Incredibly, none of Halsey's staff apparently deem this to be an important matter. They make no reaction to it, although being nudged by some of the subordinate commanders, and they inexcusably fail to notify Admiral Kincaid that they have identified Korea as heading back towards San Bernardino Strait. So now we turn to Thomas C. Kincaid, who's usually depicted as sort of the innocent, wounded party in these matters, but I don't think that really holds up when you actually look at exactly what Kincaid did or did not do. The first of which is that although Halsey had a lot more resources than Kincaid did, Kincaid had one resource that Halsey did not, and that's that he had sea-based, long-range, multi-engine search planes. These aircraft could have been and should have been targeted to cover San Bernardino Strait and keep track of where Korea was. And Kincaid and his staff totally botch that effort. They don't provide adequate coverage on San Bernardino Strait. Admiral Ernest J. King, who's the Commander-in-Chief of the U.S. Fleet, Chief of Naval Operations, and the senior uniformed officer of the Navy in World War II, when he reviews this, believes that Kincaid's failure to do this makes him as culpable in what ensues thereafter as Halsey. In fact, maybe more culpable than Halsey in terms of what transpires. The second major error that Kincaid and his staff make is that they fail to confirm that Task Force 34 was guarding San Bernardino Strait in timely fashion. Now that brings us to the issue of what is Task Force 34 and what's its significance. Well, Halsey had decided that in terms of closing in on the northern force to complete its destruction, he was going to detach from Task Force 38 6 fast battleships and a few cruisers and destroyers to screen them, and send them ahead of the carriers so they could catch up and destroy crippled Japanese ships or any Japanese ships that might survive the attack of his aviators and complete the annihilation of the northern force. Halsey issues a radioed order confirming that he intends to do this to create Task Force 34 to Admiral Nimitz. Admiral Kinkaid's communicators intercept a message. What Admiral Kinkaid's communicators don't figure out, and Kinkaid does not figure out, is that Halsey's dispatch order is in fact what's called a preparatory order. It is a signal of his intention to form Task Force 34, not actually to form Task Force 34. To get Task Force 34 created requires a second and execute order in order to create Task Force 34. This order is not going to be issued by Halsey or his staff until deep into the evening of October 24th, 25th, and the actual formation of Task Force 34 is going to take place during the night. But during the evening of the 24th, Kinkaid and the staff think that Task Force 34 has been created, and moreover, they've intercepted another message from Halsey, in which Halsey says he's heading north with 3 groups, and they conclude that Halsey is left behind Task Force 34. And to understand this, we need to do a little quick math. As I mentioned earlier, Halsey's Task Force 38 originally sails with 4 groups of fast carriers and their escorts. As we talked about, he detached the one group on the 23rd of October. That would leave him with 3 groups with Task Force 38. If he had formed Task Force 34, that would take him back up to 4 groups. So when Kinkaid intercepts a message saying Halsey's heading north with 3 groups, he and his staff leap to the conclusion that Halsey had left behind a 4th group, which they assume is Task Force 34, guarding San Bernardino Strait. Lo and behold, about 3 or 3:30 in the morning on October 25th, Kinkaid is meeting with his staff, and it occurs to them that they've premised their whole plan on the notion that Task Force 34 is guarding San Bernardino Strait, and they haven't confirmed it. So they send a message off to Halsey to ask for confirmation that that's what Task Force 34 is doing. And that message, because it's caught up in the delayed communications because of the separation of commands, is not going to get through until about the time Admiral Kurita makes his very unexpected and wanted appearance off the island of Samar. Which brings us to error number 3. Now, Task Force 34 and Kurita's task force are comprised of fast, heavy warships. They're capable of steaming in formation and sustaining probably a task force speed of about 25 knots. The heavy guns on the battleships on both forces can fire about 16 to 20 some miles, which means a 1-hour footprint of either task force is anywhere from 41 to 45 miles. Even if you assume that Task Force 34 is going to engage Kurita off San Bernardino Strait or somewhere near there, it would behold the commander of the Southern Fleet to take care to have his escort carrier groups, which are somewhere up north in those general waters, to be well clear of any area where the Japanese and Halsey's battleships are going to engage themselves. Well, as it turns out, when Admiral Kurita encounters one of these fast units of escort carriers, he sights them at a distance of about 23 or 25 miles visually from one of his battleships. The Japanese are then about 20 miles off the coast of Samar. That's a total of 43 to 45 miles. So the question is, what the hell are the escort carriers doing that close to Samar on the morning of the 25th of October? Why hasn't Kinkaid's command and its staff taken care to make sure there's much more sea room between them and any potential action off San Bernardino Strait or the island of Samar? So that now brings us to the battle off Samar. You're going to be able to get the entire slide deck and be able to study this particular order of battle slide at your leisure. But the basic fact is this, that the American Escort Carrier Group is immortalized by its radio call sign, which was Taffy 3. It comprises 6 modest escort carriers and 7 escorts, only 3 of which are destroyers and 4 destroyer escorts. Kurita's task force, which is the main part of the Imperial Japanese Navy, has 23 ships closing in on Taffy 3. David matched up much stronger to Goliath than Taffy 3 does to Kurita's center force. So what happens? Well, the American carriers are under the command of Rear Admiral Clifton Albert Francis Sprague. He's a Boston boy, a Naval Academy graduate. He's a career aviator. If you look over his career to this moment, there's not a whole lot that would lead you to conclude that he was well fitted to face what another naval officer is going to call the ultimate of desperate circumstances, at least in his naval career. Now, there is one aspect about Clifton Sprague's background that does, in my view, help prepare him for this moment. You see, his brother and his sister-in-law are F. Scott Fitzgerald, the writer, and Zelda Fitzgerald, F. Scott's rather, shall we say, free-thinking wife. They have made a career in their lives of surprises and desperate situations. And that's what I think prepares Clifton Sprague for this moment of destiny. When he is convinced finally, because at first he doesn't believe it, that he is encountering the main portion of the Japanese fleet with this little task unit, he immediately issues a set of very shrewd orders. First of all, he orders all of his escort carriers to launch all the aircraft they possibly can as fast as they can. Secondly, he orders all his ships to start making smoke. The American ships can make two types of smoke. One is funnel smoke, which is basically made by limiting the amount of air going to the boilers, so you get impure burning and turn out either dark gray or black funnel smoke. The American ships are also equipped with artificial smoke generating equipment, which make this billowy white smoke. And this smoke is designed to conceal his ships from the Japanese. First of all, it conceals from the Japanese exactly what they've run into. And for most of the battle, Kurita and his subordinate commanders believe they run into one of, Admiral Halsey's task units rather than this lowly group of escort carriers. The other thing it does is because the Japanese are dependent upon visual observation to adjust their gunfire, it plays hob with Japanese gunnery because it becomes very difficult for the Japanese to keep track of where the American ships are. The scene is a panorama shot taken from the escort carrier Kalinin Bay, one of Sprague's escort carriers. This gives you some sense of what it looked like to be with Taffy 3. It is fleeing from the Japanese behemoth that's converging on them. You'll see they're making dark funnel smoke and also white artificial smoke. You'll also notice there, just to the left of center, the splashes from heavy caliber Japanese gunfire falling around Taffy 3. Now, having given the first orders to launch his aircraft and also to make smoke, Sprague then does what he has to do, which is to order his escort vessels, the 3 destroyers and the 4 destroyer escorts, to launch counterattacks against the Japanese. Now, this is sort of ultra-heroic. The only ships that Sprague has available, which were designed originally for a fleet action, were 3 of the magnificent Fletcher-class destroyers, the Hull, the Herman, and the Johnston. And these 3 destroyers sail off to take on these enormously more powerful Japanese battleships and cruisers single-handedly or in small groups. They close in, launch torpedoes. The Hull, which is has the pennant of the screen commander, is overwhelmed and sunk fairly early in the battle. The Herman and the Hull launch torpedoes. Fortuitously, although their torpedoes don't connect, one of the spreads of torpedoes closes in on the Japanese flagship, the battleship Yamato, which has Kurita. Yamato has to turn away and loses about 10 miles of distance on the battle. As a result of that, Kurita loses what we would now call situational awareness. He really doesn't know what's going on in terms of what's happening in the battle at that moment, thanks to the torpedo spread from some of the American destroyers. The most famous of the American destroyers, though, is the destroyer Johnston, commanded by Commander Evans. Evans is a Naval Academy graduate. He's from Oklahoma. He's very proud of his Cherokee heritage. And without orders, he initially goes off to attack the Japanese fleet, even before Sprague issues the order. The ship closes in, actually scores a torpedo hit, the only one that's any of the screening vessels will score on any of the Japanese vessels, and slows down one of the Japanese heavy cruisers. The Johnston is then clobbered by Japanese gunfire, including battleship rounds, sustains heavy damage. The bridge area is hit very heavily. Evans himself is badly wounded. He loses a couple fingers. The steering control is out. Johnston has to go aft on the ship to issue verbal orders for manual control of the ship from her stern, and still steers Johnston back into the action, supporting other ships until Johnston is finally overwhelmed and sunk, and Evans is lost. Evans is, of course, bestowed the Medal of Honor posthumously, one of the most heroic actions of an action that produces many heroic actions in the war, one of the greatest moments of American naval history. Now, it was my privilege to get to know Robert Hagen, who was the gunnery officer and the senior survivor of the destroyer Johnston. And Bob Hagen was, of course, quite proud of the actions of the escorts of Taffy 3. He's also included the destroyer escorts which are even less capable than the destroyers were of taking on the Japanese. But they steam out and also engage the Japanese heavy cruisers and battleships, one of which, the Samuel B. Roberts, in particular, distinguished itself in the Sakhalin battle. Bob Hagan pointed out that although there was nothing to be denied in terms of acknowledging the heroism of the surface vessels on Sprague's command, the key component that enabled the survival of Taffy 3 were the carrier aviators from the escort carriers. These men not only took off with whatever armament they had, frequently not nearly what they wanted to have, they would launch attacks on the Japanese vessels. These were critical because they forced the Japanese heavy ships to maneuver. And when the Japanese heavy ships maneuvered, they lost their gunnery track on the American vessels and thus foiled Japanese gunnery for hour after hour. Moreover, even after they expended their ordnance, many of these pilots came in and made dummy runs on the Japanese with no ordnance whatsoever. The Japanese, of course, did not know that those aircraft had no weapons, had to react accordingly and maneuver. And once again, because the Japanese fire control was dependent on visual observation, with the smoke and the continuing attacks by the American escort carrier aircraft, which were also included the ships from the other two escort carrier groups, Taffy 1 and Taffy 2, their gunnery was not nearly up to par. They should have been able to annihilate Taffy 3 in a very short order, but the action goes on for almost 2.5 hours, and the survival of Taffy 3 is almost entirely dependent upon the fact that the smoke screens in the carrier plane and the escorts attacks foiled the Japanese from closing and annihilating Taffy 3, as would have been expected in any sort of tabletop maneuver. Finally, as the action, which began just before 7 in the morning, finally about 9:30 in the morning, Admiral Caritas, for reasons that are still mysterious, decides to turn around and withdraw his task force, even though some of the ships have closed into very close range and are on the verge of annihilating Taffy 3. Carita pulls away, and it takes a whole series of observations from various ships to report that Admiral Sprague, the Japanese are in fact withdrawing. And this then comes one of the great moments, one of the great one-liners by an American serviceman during World War II. One of the signalmen on the flagship, the Fanshawe Bay, upon finally realizing what the Japanese are doing, looks at the situation and sees that Taffy 3 has been fleeing for its life for 2.5 hours in a desperate circumstance, expecting annihilation at any moment. As he sees the Japanese retreating, he calls out, "Damn it, boys, they're getting away." So now let's turn to Admiral Halsey. He's taken Task Force 38, the 3 groups north to engage the Japanese carriers. This is called the Battle of Cape Engano. Again, here's another slide giving the order of battle information. You'll be able to study it at your leisure after the presentation. Cape Engano, in fact, is Spanish, and it translates as Cape Deception, which is, of course, very ironic as to what happens. Halsey closes in the morning, launches massive strikes from Task Force 38. Before the morning and afternoon are over, they sink all 4 Japanese carriers, including the Zuikaku, which was one of the Pearl Harbor attackers, the 3 light carriers. The carrier aviators put down one of the Japanese destroyers, another destroyer sunk by Halsey surface forces, and the light cruiser sunk by an American submarine. Nonetheless, the rest of Admiral Zawa's command survives, which is something that Zawa did not expect when the operation started. As this is going on, Admiral Halsey begins receiving dispatches telling him about the Battle off Samar and basically urging him, first of all, to account for where Task Force 34 is and send those ships south to engage Admiral Carita. Well, Halsey is upset over a message he receives from Admiral Nimitz that we'll talk about some more later. He is procrastinating his decision to detach some of his battleships to go after Carita, and finally makes a very belated decision to do so. Then they have to refuel some destroyers, and then Halsey detaches his 2 fastest battleships, the Iowa and his flagship in New Jersey, to make a last-minute high-speed dash to intercept Carita, and he falls short in that. This is sometimes called Bull's Run. He fails to get into action against the Japanese. One of the great frustrations of his naval career, and the Japanese retreat. During the 26th, the American aircraft primarily catch up with and destroy a few more of the Japanese fleet units, and that ends the battle. So now let's look briefly at the losses. There's a slide that gives you all the numbers. Once again, you'll be able to look at that at your leisure, and you'll see that the Japanese lose about 25 ships, Americans lose about 6. I ran an Excel spreadsheet with the data I could develop on Japanese casualties. I get the number of losses just on the Japanese warships has about 3,500. There were some more Japanese aviators which are lost. American losses in terms of loss of life are probably somewhere above 1,500, most of those in the American escort carrier groups, because during the day, the Japanese also launched their first formal kamikaze attacks, and they sink the light carrier St. Lo in Taffy 3. The other carriers that were sunk in Taffy, other carrier that was sunk in Taffy 3 was at Gambier Bay, as I mentioned, the Hull, the Johnston, and the Samuel B. Robertson escorts. So now let's look at the scorecard for Admiral Halsey in terms of his performance at Leyte Gulf. I think the first thing you can say is that he erred in grossly overestimating the damage that was done to Korea on the 24th of October. He had been in the war a long time, and new pilots tend to report optimistically on what they've accomplished. That's primarily because it's very difficult to observe accurately in the middle of a battle, especially in an aircraft. Secondly, he failed to recognize that the Zawa was a decoy force, although some of his subordinates suspected that was the case and reported that to Halsey and his staff. This was brushed off. As far as Halsey was concerned, the Japanese carriers were the main force. His assessment that the Southern Fleet could handle Admiral Kurita, interestingly enough, later after the war, the Naval War College conducts an analysis and reaches the very interesting conclusion that Halsey was right on this, although most accounts always take it as a matter for granted that Halsey was in fact quite wrong. He committed a very severe error in failing to notify Kincaid and Nimitz, for that matter, clearly that he was leaving San Bernardino Strait completely unguarded. And finally, the other thing that is really damning about Halsey's performance is when they received reports that Kurita had turned back on the evening of the 24th, 25th of October, for reasons that are totally inexplicable, they failed to assure that Kincaid plainly understood this is what was happening. And his handling of operation on the 25th are really one of the low points of his command period. He's very late in responding, and his decision to detach the Iowa and New Jersey is usually deemed to be unsound. So let's turn to Kincaid. Kincaid doesn't do very well in this assessment either. First of all, he doesn't use the search planes, as we mentioned, to verify where Kurita was. That was a capability he had. That was a failure of his. Secondly, he makes a very severe error by assuming, rather than confirming, that Task Force 34 is operating off San Bernardino Strait. And finally, he makes this terrible mistake of not making sure his escort carrier groups are entirely clear of this battle he assumes is going to shape up off San Bernardino Strait or down off the coast of Samar, and have them at least 60 miles or more away from the coast. In point of fact, when the Japanese visually sight Taffy 3, it's at the extreme outer limits of their visual field from their highest point in the task force, which is the top of their battleships. Had Taffy 3 been as many as 5 nautical miles further to the east, they may very well have not have been detected by Kurita. That's how close was the discovery of Taffy 3 to taking place or not taking place. As a result of that failure with respect to Taffy 3, Kincaid's staff also completely bollockses the efforts to recover survivors from Taffy 3, which is only due to the initiative of junior officers that they recover survivors, and more than 100 American sailors who might otherwise have been saved or lost as a result of Kincaid's failure to organize the surrender, the recovery of those personnel. Kincaid also makes this panic message on the 25th about Taffy 3, which probably would serve only to incite the Japanese for greater efforts. And as I mentioned, he's responsible for this failure to recover the survivors from Taffy 3. Now what we're going to do is I'm going to switch it over to Chris McDougall to talk about a component of the story of the Battle of Leyte Gulf. And when Chris is finished, we'll come back here to take your questions. Now, to set this up, I was working at the Nimitz Education Research Center reading a memoir of a fellow named Elmer Ottinger. And in the course of reading that memoir, which I thought was mainly going to talk about his encounters with Admiral Nimitz, he talked about an episode in the battle, which has become very famous, which is sometimes referred to as the World Wonders message. And the background to this is as follows. When Nimitz is monitoring by radio what's happening off Leyte in the morning of October 25th, he too becomes concerned about what has happened to Taffy 3, and he too wants to know where Task Force 34 is. So a message is drafted to find out, to notify Halsey that Admiral Nimitz wants to know where Task Force 34 is. In setting up this message, the communicators use the proper procedure. which to add to the message what's called padding. Padding is supposed to be nonsense words that are placed at the beginning and the end of the message. This is on the inside of American code breakers who've advised the code makers that the most vulnerable parts of messages, especially short messages, are the beginning and the end of the message, which are likely to be stereotypical phrases, which a code breaker can guess and use as a way of a crib to break into the message, maybe even a greater break into coded communications. Now, under the communications protocols, the padding is supposed to be separated from the text of the message by double consonants. And what you see on the screen is the message that was drafted up. Turkey trots to water, obviously nonsense. GG, telling the people who receive the message that padding, that's supposed to be ripped off the message before it's given to Halsey. Where is Task Force 34? RR, again, this tells the communicators that this is padding. This too is supposed to be removed from the message. But the communicators on Halsey's flagship, New Jersey, believe that this might be part of the message. And they also think that there's going to be someone on Halsey's staff who will recognize the protocol and realize that the RR signals that the phrase "the world wonders" is padding. Well, instead, the message goes up to Halsey, who does not understand padding because he normally does not see it. No one explains this to him. Halsey thinks the world wonders is part of the message, and he thinks he's just been insulted by Admiral Nimitz. He gets upset, and that influences his decision-making on the 25th of October. So that's the background to that message. The question, the thing that we didn't know for a long time was, who was the individual who drafted up this message, including the phrase, "the world wonders"? And this memoir from Elmer Oettinger gave us a clue, a name. And that's where I turned to Chris McDougall, or as I refer to him as Chris Sherlock McDougall at the Nimitz Education Center, and ask him, hey, can you help me, Chris? Is this guy's memoir correct? Is there such a guy as Don Castor, as Oettinger recognizes? So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Chris.
Greetings from Fredericksburg. The collections at the archives at the National Museum of the Pacific War are more of on a personal level. Most of our collections are made up of items that came to us from veterans and veterans' families. We have a very rich collection, but we don't cover everything. We don't have everything related to the Pacific Theater. When Rich approached me with a research request that he had, the name that he had was Dan Koster, Koster, and this is the memoir that he found that information in. I used that information to do a quick search of our collections to see if we might have a SyncPack roster with that name on it. The request came to me in the afternoon, and it took me a few hours right before time to leave for the day, but I eventually did find a roster. The name that I found wasn't a perfect match, but it was close. But the name was, the last name was Castor, K-A-S-T-E-R, not Koster. And there were two initials at the beginning of it, J-D. This is the roster that I found. And ironically enough, the date on this roster is just a week or two after the events at Leyte Gulf. The roster shows individuals that worked in communications at SyncPack. So between it being the communication section, the time period, and a name that roughly matched, it seemed like that name was a high probability of being the person that we were looking for. But like I said, I found the roster right before time to go for the weekend, so I wasn't able to do much more with it. I decided to go home and use that information to do some detective work through Ancestry.com. I do a lot of genealogy work at home. And sure enough, over the weekend, I was able to find several service records and some newspaper items that showed that this individual was actually named John Donald Castor, and he was known as Don Castor. So that was even more proof that it was more than likely the right individual. The key piece of information, though, that I found in that database was a World War II bonus record from Iowa. On that record, this Don Castor had laid out all of his assignments during the war. One of them was at SINCPAC, so additional proof right there. Another thing that stood out to me was on that record was that he showed that he had served on USS Northampton. Now, going back to Edinger's memoir, Edinger noted that this individual that sent the World Wonders message had received a field promotion. They had been an enlisted person, and due to some act of bravery during the war, they had been elevated to an officer. When I saw that this Don Castor had been on Northampton, a light went off, and I automatically thought of the fact that Northampton was sunk during the Battle of Tassafaronga. And if Castor had been on that crew, that would have been prime opportunity for him to perform some sort of act of bravery. With all of this information that I collected over the weekend, I went back to work on Monday and decided to see if we could find more information in the archives to further corroborate what I found. I was able to find a collection of anecdotes from USS Northampton survivors in our collections. This is the cover of that collection. And in that collection of anecdotes was a very lengthy description of what the communications officer on Northampton witnessed and experienced that day. And that officer specifically described being with Don Castor and what Don Castor had done with him as the Northampton was sinking. The ship had received 2 torpedo hits. It was listing. It was dark inside the ship, and they had to travel inside the ship and locate the code books and destroy them. And that, to me, sounded like a heroic enough act that Castor may have been recognized for that and promoted. So that also matched what Edinger had put in his memoirs. With all of these clues and all of this information that I had, I felt pretty positive that I had the right person. But I wanted to see what Rich thought. So I emailed everything to Rich, laid out my theory, and within a couple of hours, he responded and let me know that I seemed to have the right person. And he called me the superhero of the archives. And it's been a really crazy, wild adventure since then. And with that concludes my recollections, and we'll take some questions.